Hello and welcome to another episode of Coffee with Thorben, where we talk about JPA, Hibernate, working from home, and other software development related topics. So I hope you're doing great and that you grabbed your beverage of choice. For me, in the middle of the afternoon, that's clearly a coffee. And that you prepared a few questions. So let me quickly double check that everything works well and that I can see the chat everywhere. That looks great. Yeah, so let me share my screen and go into the first question that I've prepared. And if you have any questions, feel free to post them in the chat on YouTube, Facebook, or Periscope. And then I will do my best to answer them. Okay, so let's start with this one. It was posted on my blog on an article about DTO projections, which I try to explain why and when you should use them and how to actually do that. So where is it? It's here. So Michael asked, I have a set of domain objects with a single table inheritance. Is it possible to get the discriminator value or domain class name using a DTO projection? I don't need the domain specific columns, only the type and a few of the abstract base class. I only need a few columns to get count statistics, so I don't want to get the full domain objects. And if possible, I'd like to avoid using a native query. Thanks in advance. Well, then I have bad news for Michelle, because, well, there is not really a way to avoid a native query and to access the discriminator value. So when you're modeling an inheritance hierarchy and you use single table strategy, then you usually model a column that keeps the discriminator value, which tells Hibernate to which object class it has to map the records in that domain model. And this is a column that Hibernate manages and that you can't access in your query code with Hibernate, but you could do that with a native query. So let's write a quick answer. Let me share. You unfortunately can't access the discriminator column in a JPQL or criteria query. You could either use type expression, and I would spend a few seconds checking. I'm sure that I have an article about that. Let's quickly check. Where did I write about that? So JPA, and in this case, especially JPQL, provides a function that you can call to get the type of an entity object and to then use that in your query. And I'm pretty sure that I explained that somewhere, maybe here. Take a quick look. Join polymorphism and downcasting. Okay, there we can treat it as something. Where clauses. Treat as type, so then that can be used to downcast the superclass to a specific subtype. No, unfortunately not. Okay, then let's keep it like that. You either use a type expression to get the type of an entity object, or you need to use a native query. Okay, let's quickly check the chat and see if there are any questions that I should answer. Yeah, first of all, hi to Deepak, Rudolf, Orhan, nice to meet you, and Brut. And well, the first question was by Rudolf. He wrote that right now he's reading about blocking mechanisms in JPA. It's all about optimistic and pessimistic locking, and he doesn't really understand it and how to apply that in an application. Yeah, locking is a simple and complex topic at the same time, and I go into great details about it in my Hibernate performance tuning course. But let's do a quick rundown here. So you basically have two options to handle concurrent access to your entities, and especially to avoid the issue that two parallel transactions try to update the same record in the database, and by doing that start overriding each other and creating other concurrency issues. So one option would be pessimistic locking. Pessimistic locking uses database logs as they are supported by your database. And you can distinguish there between a read and a write log. A read log logs the access to that record for all, or blocks access to that record for all transactions who try to request a write log. So to all transactions who try to change that specific row. The write log blocks the access to both of them, and you can set that as an additional property on the query. So the benefit of pessimistic locking is that you can be sure that after you retrieve the read log, nobody else would change it. If you get a write log, then there will be no conflicts when you're writing the record. On the other hand, it creates a bunch of scalability issues because it's way harder to get a write log if there's a lot of read traffic on that database table, and it sequentializes the write access to a specific record, and that's why optimistic locking is the more common approach. Optimistic locking is implemented by adding a version column to your database table and adding a version attribute to your entity class. The important thing there is that you annotate it with add version. Hibernate then automatically increments the version number in that column with each and every write operation and checks that columns or that field still contains the same value as it did when Hibernate fetched the entity from the database when it performs any kind of write operation. Based on that, you can then detect concurrent modifications, and the first, well, if you have two transactions that run in parallel, the first one will be committed successfully, all others will fail because Hibernate will recognize that we didn't update any records in the database. So Deepak asked on Periscope if I could write an article on records in core Java. Well, I wrote an article about records with and how to use them with Hibernate, but I'm not writing any articles on core Java topics. There are other people out there who have way deeper knowledge of all the nitty-gritty details of the latest JVM features and everything. So if you want to dive deeper into that, I recommend taking a look at Nikolai Parlok's blog, for example, at nipafx.org. I think it should be nipafx.org. He's writing really great content about basic Java. Let me quickly post the link to the article about using records with Hibernate in the chat. So anyone who wants to take a look at that can read that and learn a little bit more about that. What else do we have here? Wolf asked if I could say something about second level cache. Sure. So that's another topic of the Hibernate Performance Tuning online course. And there we go into great details about the 3 different kinds of caches that Hibernate supports. The second level cache is one of them. The second level cache is a Hibernate session independent cache on the application layer that contains entity objects. And Hibernate uses it whenever you fetch an entity by its ID using the entity manager find, or when you're traversing associations. And Hibernate then first checks the first level cache, then the second level cache, and gets the object from there. The great thing about the second level cache is that you don't need to worry about modifications on these cached objects or anything. Hibernate handles that automatically for you. So invalidates parts of the cache whenever you change something or updates specific objects. That's something that's really easy to use, and that provides great performance benefits if you have at least 9 to 10 read operations for each write operation for that entity object. Let me see if I have a quick example for that. So do I have something here? Yeah, I do. Let's switch the screen to this one and talk quickly about the second level cache. So the first thing you need to do is you need to activate the shared cache mode in your persistence.xml. I recommend using enable selective. And then you can annotate your entity classes with JPA set cacheable annotation to activate caching for these objects. And then you can something like this here. You have the first transaction that gets an author by its ID that gets automatically stored in the second level cache. And down here we have a second transaction which would run in a second which would be a second backend request. Oh, I just recognized I didn't start my database container. Let's quickly start up the Docker container with PostgreSQL and run that test again. Okay, database is up. And now it works. Okay, so what happens here? So we see session 1, which would be the first request to our backend. We execute a query, and we can see here in the statistics that we put a record into the cache, and then we have the second session. You can see here there is no database, no SQL statement going on. We see here that we had 0 JDBC statements, but we had a hit on the second level cache, and we got the author object from there. And can now use it in our application. And whenever you change something here, then the data in the cache gets automatically updated. Yeah. As I said, this gets automatically used whenever you call the entity manager find method, whenever you traverse an association on which the foreign key column is mapped by an entity that you already cached. So can I show that in this example? No, unfortunately, I can't. So if you have associations between your entities, which you for sure have, then Hibernate automatically caches associations. And whenever you cache an entity that maps the foreign key column, if it doesn't, then you need to take a few extra steps that then add the association to the cache, but that's pretty simple and you can do that quickly. Yeah. Akash asked in the chat how to create multi-server sequence generator. Well, that's pretty simple. You use a database sequence, and then Hibernate gets the sequence values from there. So the only thing you need to do is you need from a key attribute, you annotate it with that ID, and then you annotate it with generated value. And for all databases except for MySQL, I think, generation type auto will default to sequence, or you could use generation type sequence here, and then Hibernate gets it from there. And because the database is taking care of creating unique primary key values, you don't need to worry about horizontally scaling your application and handling the ID generation there because the database handles all these issues for you. Para asks, what are you doing? Well, I'm streaming. Right now, I'm spending most of my time either working on the blog and the articles there or teaching workshops. Last week, for example, I attended a hybrid conference as a speaker, the JaxCon here in Germany, gave 2 talks and a workshop there. Next week, I will teach a workshop at a customer. And whenever I have a little bit of time left, I'm working on a secret project that I will launch in, I don't know, 2 to 3 weeks. If everything goes well, let's see. But yeah, that will be something that I will reveal here on the social media channels and on the blog and the email list as soon as I'm a little bit closer to the release date. Thomas asked, hi, is it possible to use DTO projection, which is a constructor expression, for a class that have enum field? Sure, you can use that in the same way as you do for classes that don't use enums or don't have any enum attributes. Let's quickly check here, JPQL, constructor expression. So constructor expression is something like this here. In this project, I have a class called bookValue, which is, see it here, a basic Java class without any annotations. The only important thing is we have a constructor here that takes all attribute values. And then we set the ID, the title, and the publisher name in this case as constructor parameter values. And if the book would have an attribute of some enum type, for example, the format, so an attribute that stores if it's a paperback or an ebook or whatever, then you would just add the attribute here. Hibernate would apply the enum mapping to the value retrieved from the database and then provides it as a parameter to the constructor of the book value class. Okay, Dan wrote, the above case I've shared link to is something I've tried to get help with. It is on projections and case expressions. Could you please have a look? Well, I don't see a link in the chat, but let me switch to browser window. And I think I answered a question today about that. Did I prepare that for this stream? Give me a second. Dan, did you post the chat the question today on did you post the question on Stack Overflow and added a link to it to the comment on my blog? So because I answered this question here today about case expressions, and it sounds like you might be asking a similar question. So the question here was, if we have a case expression like this one in our select statement, how can we use that in our criteria query, and especially how can we order by the cat num here? And the only thing we can do is we can use this case select here down there in the order by clause. That worked perfectly fine for me when I tried that today. So let's take a step back. The general idea is you take the criteria builder, you call the select case method to create such a case expression. Then you do something there, whatever your case expression needs to do. And you keep a reference to that expression. You can then provide it to the select clause of your criteria query. And you can also use that in the order by clause. Unfortunately, I didn't find a way to reference the alias in the order by clause, but you can reference the case select. And in that case, the same case expression will be added to the order by clause, and it will work there as well. So then posted another message down in the chat. Is there a way to write a custom handler for DTO projections? For example, I want to retrieve data into my projection object, but to have a method handling special cases. Well, you could use a case expression in your query. That would handle the different cases in the select statement, and then the DTO projection is something that gets applied as a post-processing step. So here in this case, when I run this test case, Hibernate selects these three columns in the database query, and then maps it to book value objects, the constructor expression doesn't show up in the is that the right one? Let's try again. So the constructor expression here doesn't show up in the select statement because your database doesn't know about any constructors or Java classes or anything. What happens is that Hibernate uses the references to these three entity attributes to create a select clause. And then it gets a result set with these three values and uses them to call the constructor of the book value. So if you add a case expression to your query, then that one would show up here and it would return one value. And you could then just use that value in your constructor. So yeah, that wouldn't be an issue. If you have anything that you can't do in your database query, then you would need to implement that in your constructor. Justin asks, could you share your thoughts on how to extract large blobs, for example, 10 megabyte, and expose data as API in an effective manner? Well, that depends on the type of data that you're storing in that blob. Well, in most cases, it was previously a file. And my general recommendation there would be to store that file on your backend server and to then just provide a link to it, maybe to a streaming solution or something like that. The main reason for that is that these large blobs are quite often video files, image files, audio files, stuff like that. And we usually already have a web server as part of our deployment. For example, as part of the Java EE application server or the Apache into which we deploy our Spring application. And these servers are already optimized for handling these kinds of data, or you can get extensions for them that are optimized for that. And because of that, I would try to reuse that instead of implementing a different solution in within your application. If you can't do that, then you need to take a look at data streaming. That's a rather complex topic that I wouldn't want to discuss here on the stream without preparing an example for it and everything. But in general, you could also stream the data from the database through your application layer to the client. But yeah, as I said, there are optimized solutions that were specifically developed for these kind of things. So why should you implement it yourself, right? Abel Kings wrote, could you let me know if there's any benefit using JDBC template against Spring projection when it comes to DTO fetching? Well, JDBC template is great if you don't want object relational mapping and if you want to if you need to execute complex SQL statements. In that cases, I would recommend using JDBC template instead of Hibernate and instead of Spring Data JPA. If you need object related, or if you want to use object relational mapping from most of your use cases, I would recommend to use the constructor expression instead of JDBC templates to implement your query there to keep everything within the same stack. Would be the short form. Yeah, hi David. Yeah, you're welcome, Rudolph. Happy to answer questions here. Then you also ask, how often is entity graph used Do you use that? Yes, I use entity graphs every now and then. So my default approach would be to use a join fetch clause if I need to initialize an association within a query. And if I get into the situation that I would need to use a complex query with multiple different fetch graphs, or with multiple different fetching behaviors, then I wouldn't use a join fetch clause. Then I would define the query without the association fetching and define multiple entity graphs and then combine the two with each other. So use the query with different entity graphs. That works pretty well. Yeah, but I would only use that if you need to use the same query with different fetching behavior in different situations. Otherwise, a join fetch clause is just the simpler and more straightforward approach. Okay. Yeah, everything. My pleasure to answer the questions. Okay, so I caught up with all the messages in the chat as it seems, and then let's take a look at the other questions on the blog that I picked for this stream. Okay, here it is. So we answered this one, and I answered that one. Okay. Then we have another here. So Sergey asked, is there any way to join separate table? No one-to-one or one-to-many between entities instead of I want to get next. Okay, yeah. So in this article here, I explain how to use left join and join fetch clauses in the criteria and query and what are the actual differences between them. So join fetch clauses or all join clauses in a criteria query are based on a defined association in your domain model. You can't use that with associations that are not modeled in your entity model. You could do that with Hibernate. Let me quickly, there it is. So with Hibernate in JPQL, you can use a join that looks very similar to a join you would model in your in your SQL query. Increase the font size here a little bit. Okay, so there you could do something like this here. You can say join person P with phone book entry N on P.firstname equals N.firstname, and last name has to be equal. So there we have an on clause on our in our join. JPQL, as it's defined by the JPA standard, doesn't support that, and because of that, also the criteria API doesn't support that. The only thing you can do there is to use a cross join. Pretty sure I have an article about that as well. Let me quickly check. So what you would do there is you would, that is. Oh, that isn't. Okay, then I explain it without the article. So what you would do there is you would do would call the from method on your criteria query multiple times, and then you would add a specific condition to so you can call that part here multiple times, and then you would add a where condition to your where clause to make sure that you just don't create a Cartesian product and you limit it to the records that actually match. So basically the same thing you do in the on clause. From a performance point of view, that actually makes a difference. If the query optimizer doesn't detect that and optimizes it, then this approach performs not as good as a classical join that you could model with SQL or with Hibernate's JPQL extension. Quickly answer this one. Hi Sergey, no, unfortunately, no, you can't do that with criteria query. You can only use a cross join as explained here. Okay, now after this stream, I will then get the link that didn't work a minute ago. Okay, let's take another look at the chat. So King asks, if I use Spring projection with Spring expression language for binding where condition for native query, I can handle some complex scenarios. Do you think it's a good idea to use Spring expression language in native query? Well, in general, that should work without any issue. The only thing I would recommend is take a look at the actual database query that gets generated and sent to the database. And if you don't see any issue there, then this is totally fine. In this situation, where you use the expression language in the where clause of a native query, I wouldn't expect any issues. That should just work fine. You need to be a little bit careful if you use Spring expression language within your projection of a JPQL query, for example. That would end up in fetching entity objects and then applying the expression language to the actual objects, and that could cause n+1 issues. Or in general not be as efficient as you would expect when you take a first look at the projection. I explained that in a recent article about projections in Spring Data JPA. I will post a link to that in the chat. Where is it? That is. Okay. So Witsky wrote, Hibernate, just want to thank you for all of your tutorials. Easiest and most comprehensive to learn. Oh, thank you very much. That's really nice of you. So glad to have you here. Glad that the tutorials help you, and yeah, and enjoy your stay. Surab asked, there's some issue with enum type with native SQL. Could you please explain that? Well, what kind of issue is there with the enum type in native query? Right now, I'm not aware of any. Usually, the mapping works perfectly fine. So, if you could tell me a little bit more about the issue, then I would try my best to answer that. Okay, Dan posted another reference to the question on Stack Overflow. Let me quickly take a look at that if I can find it. Yeah, that should be the one. Whoops. We move that into the other window there. Then we switch the view here. Okay, how to handle night pointer and spring data JPA projections. Any thoughts if there's a way to have a custom method for handling null or any other exceptions happening during projection creation? In the below JPQA query, I'm trying to compose a custom object, but when there's no data under column updated by, it's null in database, then it fails internally since cannot proceed with null object any further. Get updated by, get profile, get name. Okay, here are my entities. Here's the JPQ query I use, however, it does work due to unknown reasons. Okay, let's first of all take a look at this one up here. So when stating agreement type, agreement name type, audit, and if updated by is null, then you have an implicit inner join here, and the query will not return the value. So the main issue here is that you will not return, your result set will not contain any record that doesn't have an updated by. So it's not an issue of the projection or of the agreement type or the constructor expression. It's an issue of this join here. How do we solve that? You try the case expression here. Okay. So what I would do here is I would create a left outer join to agreement. Let me try to rewrite the query in the solution. So the dot is called the path operator, used in the constructor expression, creates an implicit inner join in your SQL query. Because of that, your result set doesn't contain any records for which is it this is null. So that's syntax and that's syntax. To avoid that, you would need to use left join to handle missing updated by references. They're not necessarily missing, they might be empty. So let's try this query, try to adapt it. So what I would do is, and this might take a few iterations to get it right. So let's start with that. A left join a dot audit left join updated by need the initial query. Left join profile p left join. No, that's good enough. Okay. So after doing that, then we can do say if up is null, then dummy name, else p.name. To be honest, I would try this. If so case when p.name is null, then dummy name, else p.name. So that's at least the general idea. No guarantee that this query works in the first one, but I would expect that this approach here should work at least after you maybe had another look at these left joins here. So the general idea is that we can't use this expression up here, because these path operators here, if you use them to navigate an association to a different entity, then we are creating an inner join in the generated SQL statement. So if updated by is not set, then this part here becomes null. Because updated by isn't set, that means there's no reference to the profile table. That means the name, oh no, totally wrong. So that these dot operators, these path operators create an inner join, which means if updated by isn't set, then the record doesn't, that data doesn't get included in the result set. And because it doesn't get included, you never see someone here with an empty profile name. Okay, Akash asks, sequence number format is prefix equals category.prefix plus year suffix sequence. For every prefix, new sequence is required, so every year change sequence will start from 1. That sounds like a follow-up of a previous message. Okay, Akash, I don't see the first message of that of your conversation. It seems like that the sequence number here isn't the first one you posted, but there's too much in the chat to find it right now. So I wrote an article about custom sequence generator. Yeah, this one. Hibernate sequence generator. So you can find it here. So what I explain here is how you can create a sequence generator similar to the one that you're using here. or describing here. So what I did was I started with month, year, and then a sequence number. And you can do that by extending Hibernate's sequence style generator and then overriding the generate method. And the interesting part here is that in your custom generate method, you call the generate method on the superclass on Hibernate's sequence style generator, because that one already implements all the required logic. Oh, sorry. Here it is. So you're extending the sequence style generator and override the generate method to create a sequence in your specific required format. And the interesting part is this one here. When you need the value from the database sequence, you call the generate method on the superclass, where Hibernate already provides all the logic required to get a value from the database sequence as efficiently as possible. And then you can add a value prefix here. So how do I use that? You can see it down here. I use my reference generator in the generated value annotation. There I define a generic generator with a reference to the book sequence, and I provide my own generator class as the strategy. And then I provide some configuration data that's used within that generator. And that tells Hibernate to call this class here for each and every new, I think in this case it's a book entity that gets persisted. And then we use our own generator implementation for that. SPS Tech posted, hello Thorben, I saw your answer that got approved after 6 years. Okay. My question is on similar lines. I need to handle state exception occurring in concurrent threads. How do we handle that? Retry? I'm aware that retry can fix it in single thread. What about multiple threads? How do we fix that? Okay, that's the same message again. Well, I'm not sure which of my answers you found and where, but well, yes, you could try retry. The question is always, is a retry the right logical approach to solve the issue, or does it just work on a technical level? So quite often, I would say we need someone to double check what's going on there and why that happened, and maybe to make sure that we are not overwriting any changes or creating other issues there. But let's expect that, or let's say that we don't need to do that here. In that case, you could implement a retry mechanism on the API level. So what we did in a few projects for technical APIs was we provided a REST endpoint, and when you're having a REST endpoint, then you can implement servlet listeners for them, because internally they are servlets. So you can add a servlet listener to it, and there you can implement the retry. So you would basically just wrap the standard